Did you know the visions of the kingdoms that are described in Daniel chapter 2 help us date the text to the early 160s BCE? But if you presuppose the inspiration, the inerrancy, the univocality of the Bible, that's unacceptable, and the interpretation has to be renegotiated. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and if you Google these visions, which are of the statue made of gold and silver and bronze and iron and clay, you'll get a very similar interpretation pretty consistently that understands the gold portion to be the Babylonian Empire, then the silver portion to be the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the bronze portion at the midsection to be Greece, the legs of iron to be Rome, and then the feet and toes of iron and clay to be either the empire of the Christians or the United States of America or something like that. And there's one specific thing that has been renegotiated about this interpretation in order to fit the kingdoms in that came after the composition of this text in the 160s BCE. And that little change was to combine the kingdom of the Medes and the kingdom of the Persians. Because if you look at the narrative of Daniel, after Nebuchadnezzar comes Darius the Mede, and then after that comes Cyrus the Persian. And so Daniel understands there to be two separate kingdoms. Now, there wasn't actually a Median kingdom in this time period because the Persians conquered the Medes over a decade before Cyrus conquered Babylon. And so apologists will argue that the Medes became part of the Medo-Persian or Medo-Persian Empire, but there's absolutely no evidence that any such joint empire existed. The Medes would have just been integrated into the Persian Empire. And we know that Babylon was conquered in 539 BCE by Cyrus on behalf of the Persian Empire. So Darius the Mede is just made up. There is a Darius the Persian who came after Cyrus, but there was no Darius the Mede that came after Nebuchadnezzar and before Cyrus. So the author of Daniel 2 is misrepresenting history, but is representing the Medes as a separate empire from the Persians. And so the top portion of the statue is the Babylonian Empire, but then the chest and arms represents the Medes. And in the vision, Daniel says that the kingdom would be taken from Nebuchadnezzar by an inferior kingdom, and this would represent the Medes, who weren't really much of anything in this time period. But then the kingdom that would come after that would conquer the whole earth, and this represents the Persian Empire. So the midsection of bronze represents the Persian Empire, and then the legs of iron represents Greece. And then you have the feet and the toes, which are clay, but with some of the strength of iron. This is the Diadochi. This is the succession crisis that followed after the death of Alexander the Great, which fractured the Hellenistic Empire into a bunch of smaller regional powers who fought over control. So that's agreed by the overwhelming majority of scholars to be what was intended by the author of Daniel 2, that the end of the statue, which is going to be destroyed by the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, is the multiple regional powers of the Diadochi, the succession crisis that followed after the death of Alexander the Great. That's why it has some of the strength of iron in it. It has some of the Hellenistic rulers from the time of Alexander the Great, but it is a different empire as well. But once you combine the Medes and the Persians, you can move everything up one, you can ignore the succession crisis, and then you can put Rome at the legs, and then you can have the feet be whatever you want. That is your wild card. That is your choose your own adventure portion of the vision. And that allows you to read in whatever you want, whether it's the Christian empire that took over after Rome, or the United States of America, or whatever you want. That's the one weird trick that scholars hate, is combining the Medes and the Persians into the Medo-Persian Empire, and no such empire ever existed. And when you look at the way the different empires are represented in the narratives of Daniel, they start off being quite inaccurate. Nebuchadnezzar didn't do a lot of the stuff that is attributed to him in Daniel. Nabonidus is actually the one who's usually having his deeds attributed to Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or something like that. And there were no Medes, there was no Darius the Mede. But the closer you get to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, one of these rulers over one of the regional powers left over after Alexander the Great's death, closer you get to him, the more detailed and the more accurate the narrative becomes historically, up until, of course, the part where the author thinks that God is going to come and destroy Antiochus IV Epiphanes and deliver their people. That never happens. So you can follow the trajectory of this narrative all the way up into the early 160s BCE, and that's right where the narrative stops being accurate. And that's right where the narrative is actually moving into the future. And that's why it stops being accurate. So we can confidently date the composition of these parts of Daniel to the early 160s BCE. And that one weird trick that scholars hate is to just arbitrarily combine the Medes and the Persians into the Medo-Persian Empire, which allows you to renegotiate the significance of these visions and this statue. But when you look critically at what's going on in the narrative and these statues, it helps you date the composition of this part of Daniel to the early 160s BCE, during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, just before his rule fell apart. And the fit for this video has been Amphibia.